Speaking of humble,
Go.
you reminded me, uh, great person that you are, that I brought this whole topic of
Yes.
relinquishing authority to the
Yes.
podcast. And then I had to figure out how I had done so and in what context, because I was not ringing any bells, because, I suffer from recency and it hadn't happened in the last, week. It didn't happen to me. So I went
And
back
just
and
to
I
give our
found,
listeners a picture of what Alyssa means is, I regularly ask her to send me like what do you want to talk about on the podcast? What ideas or do you want to? And so she sends it to me in emails, and I have this little file in my email for our podcast content. And then when I build the show agendas, I go out and I pull them out. So I emailed Alyssa, and I was like, "Hey, we're going to use this thing that you brought that I think is a really cool idea. So yeah, that's what we're going to do." And apparently it had been a
yeah.
while. Sorry.
Well, I looked at the email. It's dated in April, so
Okay.
listeners, forgive me. But so I want to give you some context, dear listener, as to where I was coming from in April, and then we'll fast forward to what this topic now means to me today. Said I had a Zoom last night with a fellow coach and a dear friend, and she was relaying some of her current client work, specifically with an older white male and leaders who are and how they are struggling to navigate various either required or self-directed relinquishing of their authority in the workplace. And so what at the time that whole situation was an outgrowth of what I would categorize in the systemic power structures that we are trying to challenge in some ways in our society, right? Race, gender, and then we have on top of it that corporate hierarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to hopefully make space for people that have not traditionally been in those roles of authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's a great coach and she's done some dynamic work with that individual. But what it means to me today and trying to think about it is this whole thing as leaders, as we can do our part, right, to try to attack and dismantle those systemic power structures, and we should be doing that. But what I want to focus on is, how does that work specifically for you in your role, in your current job,
Mm-hmm.
outside of those other things, right? And so there's this whole terminology of the power over, right, versus power with. And Brene Brown does amazing work on the whole power over, power with in her Dare to Lead book. But I'm currently reading her Gifts of Imperfection. And I, again, see prior reference, I suffer from recency. And so I'm reading yesterday this section on building critical awareness. And I thought, oh my gosh, this so overlaps with how we as leaders need to try to dismantle some of our own authority and put it in check. We have to build our awareness to our what can be frankly an addiction to power. It's subtle, it creeps up over time, but I have absolutely felt this in my professional career. And it's something that I struggle with and have to keep a rein on continually. So she speaks about it as building critical awareness in this list form specific to social media and how you're digesting it. But I'll read those to you, and then I want to try to think about it and reimagine it in a way that's very specific to dismantling and relinquishing that authority
Mm-hmm.
that we try to really gravitate and hold on to in the workplace, right? Number one is what I'm seeing real? Do these images convey real or fantasy? So, how does that translate to dismantling our power in the workplace. Are you creating a real life role modeling in your position of authority? Are you devising that in a way that is sustainable and not a fantasy for people to try to achieve? These are ways in which we can try to dismantle putting ourselves up onto that pedestal. I'm going to go forward with the 2 and the 3, but I want to give you the opportunity to say, is this hitting any buttons for you? Are you like, what is the heck is she still talking about? Is she going to make sense at some point, or is it resonating with you?
No, these are big ideas, and they're absolutely related to, just as you said, in my role, in my job, day in and day out, where might I be allowing the power granted to me by the authority of my position to move me into some thinking or decisions or behavior that is flawed? I think that's a really important thing for us to explore. Go ahead and finish your list, and let's bring it back to that, because I think that's really where the sweet spot is for our listeners.
Okay, so now again, number 2, do these images reflect healthy, wholehearted living, or do they turn my life, my body, my family, and my relationships into objects and commodities? So that's pretty straightforward in terms of what are you doing or not doing that is perpetuating this concept of people are what they do for you and for this company, that their worth is wrapped up in their professional career, that you care specifically about the commodity rather than the relationship that you have with those individuals. And the third one is, who benefits from my seeing these images and feeling bad about myself? And then she writes, hint, this is always about money and or control.
What are they selling? Yes.
Right? So what are we trying to benefit or profit off of? Are we creating in ourselves, again, a critical awareness to the level of impact, of control that we're trying to have over people, and the money that we're seeking, the profits that we're seeking at their expense?
Mm-hmm. And so just as a reminder to our listeners, this list that Alyssa just gave you were questions specifically around social media. But I like what you're doing in terms of saying, let's use these questions to then bring it back to what we have to question about ourselves and our own reality as leaders. And so I think one of the big things that comes out of that list, Alyssa, that is really kind of tangible for folks who are listening is, are we constantly questioning? One of the ways that we have to relinquish authority is to not always instantly trust our first impressions and our initial judgments of circumstances, of people, of their motivations. Because one of the things that we know about our brains is that our brain takes shortcuts and fills in the gaps in ways that are inaccurate. There's a ton of social science research that tells us this is the case. We don't pause to ask ourselves, well, what would make a really good person act this way, right? When we see someone doing a questionable thing, our first blush reaction is to make a character judgment. That is it's something we've talked about here on this podcast before. Yep. It's been demonstrated in behavioral economics and social science research that our judgments about people's motivations are consistently, predictably wrong because we don't always take the time to ask ourselves, what if there was a perfectly good reason for their actions or decisions? And so this questioning that you're kind of talking about, it's born of the same understanding of how our brains work. And it's an application that we need to put into our daily lives as leaders, which is question what I'm seeing, question my own judgments, question my assumptions. Am I close?
Yes, absolutely. As you were speaking, I was like, oh, that reminds me of like, check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
to be even more simpatico about it, like that. We have to be building that in, not trusting all the time that, yeah, my intentions are pure, so therefore what I am doing and seeing is pure.
Yeah.
No, you got to
And
keep your guard up even for yourself.
and just to be able to start from the understanding that everything I think is perception first. And perception is not always accurate. And shifting gears a little bit, if it's okay, I don't want to pull you away from this idea too quickly if
No.
you have more to say on it. But the idea of relinquishing authority for me, when you brought it up initially, the first thing that I thought of is what I've heard referred to as the power dial. Right? In the interactions we have with the people who work with us, sometimes we turn up our power dial and we exert more authority. We direct and we command and we squeeze a little bit. And I think that our instinct when we face resistance from employees is to turn up our power dial. We assert ourselves more strongly because of the authority granted to us in our position. I think it's human nature that bosses expect people who work for them to do what they ask because they ask. And when that doesn't happen automatically, sometimes we exert more power and more pressure from that power. And I think that's a trap that a lot of leaders fall into. When someone fails to comply with directives or is acting in a manner we see as not collaborative, I think leaders especially, might feel disrespected.
Yeah.
And so they feel maybe their knowledge or their experience or their role or their authority is threatened. And so if they experience insubordination, their instinct is to turn up their power dial. But we know that actually makes us less effective. We actually become more effective with people when we reduce our use of power. And I think that in order to do that as a leader, it means elevating the employee in your mind and questioning what's happening in that moment and saying, okay, in this moment, I want to remind myself that this employee does some things really well, that my success as a leader and our team depends on them. And there might be a perfectly good reason for them reacting in this way that has something to do with me. And so let me understand that. Let me explore that. I think this kind of self-talk can help reorient us as leaders to a style and approach that is more likely to elicit a better, more collaborative response from the employee. And so I guess what I'm saying is in those moments when you feel the urge to turn that power dial up a few clicks, experiment, try turning it down, turning it the other direction and see what happens.
I love that power dial perspective. I absolutely have suffered from that. I think of it now more acutely with parenting, right? Because as you spoke about, like,
So
I
true.
expect,
Yes.
right? I expect that they will respect my authority so much that they will do what I want the very first time, right? And ask no
Yes.
questions. Don't question me,
Yes.
right? And so, in a professional sense, that's where I think that where we're saying turn down the power dial, I'm saying amplify that critical awareness at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Start asking those questions. Okay, what? I know I have good intentions, but that power is she's a great drug. Gets me
Yeah.
so high on myself that it can be a real struggle to turn that dial down and turn up the critical awareness. This constant battle that we have to wage within ourselves as leaders to continue to keep that power in check can sometimes, I think, also get fatigued, or we think that it's going to be fatigued if we try to build too much consensus. You know, if we're going out
Yes.
to our employees, right, and we're all the time asking instead of directing, then we feel like, well, what do they have me here for?
Yes.
right? And so
Or others
here's my
perceive
little
us then as wishy-washy and lacking confidence in the leadership role. And we spend too much time trying to build bridges and make people happy than truly leading and directing when circumstances call for it.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So there's this balance of unnamed sugar bits out here. I
It's a
just
technical
censored
term.
myself.
It's a highly technical term.
that that is on one hand exactly what I at least have in my brain, that the leader's supposed to look and feel like, right? I'm supposed to
Mm-hmm.
command this authority. I'm supposed to be the person that people come to and ask. And if they're not asking, then there's something wrong, right? Versus wanting to be the leader who listens to this podcast, who empowers their people, who gives a great amount of autonomy and respect, and then doesn't want to be that person that nobody needs and kind of works themselves out of the piece of the pie that they have worked really freaking hard for all those years to get to.
I think the takeaway here is the need for leaders to develop situational awareness, and if we and to apply it literally every day. If vulnerability is a continuum and
Yeah.
power is a continuum, each situation we have to kind of take that moment to set the dials accordingly, to say, okay, in this circumstance, what is real, what might be truth, what could be happening here that I don't know, right? What don't I know? And let me figure out how vulnerable do I need to be, how much power do I need to assert? Because in some of those circumstances, it may be necessary to cut right to, this is what is happening, this is how we're doing it, we got to go do it now. Right?
Yeah.
In times of crisis, or when people don't necessarily know what you want from them, or they don't have the information they need to be successful, we have to turn up the power dial a little bit and lead. But in other circumstances where maybe we're dealing more with people's emotions or their fears, their uncertainties, or information sharing and gathering, we need to dial the power dial back a little bit and show up as that more vulnerable leader who doesn't feel that sort of draw to assert power and to say, well, I know what we need to do here, because maybe you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, we've spoken about this in prior episodes about generationally, it's easier for some folks to do that
Mm-hmm.
and build that awareness than it is for others. And I think it speaks to not just, oh, because, people are set in their ways. It's because as build your professional resume and you put in the blood, sweat, and the tears, you know what it took for you to get there. And so to relinquish that in any capacity feels like a deep threat. And so building some compassion for yourself around the fact that, hey, yeah, I did work really hard to get here. And if it all goes away tomorrow, because they deem somebody else is a better fit or my job's not needed anymore, how am I going to lead?
Yeah.
How do I want to show up on my last day?
Yeah.
Right? With these folks that I get to lead.
What's my agenda?
Yeah.
And does that agenda align with my values? Because if it does, then how you lead on your last day is how you led on your first. Or at least if those values evolved and you tweaked your leadership style, then how you lead on your last day is still it's not about you. It's still about them, the people you put at the center of your role as a leader.